Good morning. I'll be reading Luke 22:66 through 23:25. Council of the elders of the people, both the chief priest and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I ask you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then he said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priest and the crowd, "I find no basis for charge against this man." But they insisted. "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here." On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priest and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us, as you can see. He has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us." Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time he spoke to them, "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for a death penalty. Therefore, I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will.
So I think for all of us, there are a lot of words and phrases that we have used over the last year and a half that either we've never used before in our life or we never really thought we'd have to refer to that much. But I know one phrase that keeps coming up for me that I don't think I've talked about much in my life. It's every week we're hearing about it and thinking about it, and that's that phrase, supply chain. Think of how many times we're starting to think about these whatever it is that you're wanting that you can't get. You know, the last year and a half we've had times of food shortages. I remember, it was over a year ago I started grinding my own wheat. Can't buy flour. Well, I can get wheat berries. I'll just grind my own then. So we'll just, food shortages. You got inventory shortages. Try to buy anything with a processor in it. Good luck. You've got inflation. You've got these massive increases in shipping costs. I mean, we've had this great revelation that, one ship in the Suez Canal can shut the world down. And the problem with all this supply chain stuff that's going on is you can call it what it is. You can say there's a problem, but nobody can just snap a finger and fix it. It's a broken system. And when the system is broken, it's really hard to fix. It's hard to fix a broken system. And we're kind of living in the midst of a broken system and frustrated by it, trying to deal with it, learning how to navigate it. But that's what we're in. We're in a broken system. And when we think about broken systems, we've had a lot of chances to think about that on a lot of different issues over the last year and a half, about the nature of broken systems. It can be hard and frustrating, but then when we turn here to Luke 22, this section here of the trials of Jesus, what I want you to see is that Jesus, that Luke describes the trials from that perspective. He sees and he wants Theophilus to see, wants us to see that the conviction of Jesus emerged in part because of a failed system. It was a broken system that allowed him to be convicted of murder, and be convicted and sentenced to die. Everything went wrong, but that's not the whole point. This is not just a takedown of the Roman system of justice or the Jewish system of justice. There's something much deeper happening, because as he describes this broken system, he also wants us to be clear that God is accomplishing exactly what he intended to do in the midst of all of the brokenness and all of the chaos that emerges. That happens and opens for us right at the beginning. The very first thing that happens in verse 66. If you don't have your Bibles open, I'd encourage you to open up to verse 66 in Luke 22. We'll go through verse 25. But this opening is the first of several appearances he has. And Jesus is he was arrested last week. He's arrested. He's taken in. He's beaten. And then Luke is really summarizing a lot of things that are happening. And there's a lot of folks that, try to align the Gospels to see, well, what was the full unfolding of the events of that night and that morning. And it seems like what's happening, Jesus at some point is brought before the high priest, and there's like at his house, there's kind of a little sidebar where they're kind of planning what they're getting ready to do. What we hear in verse 66, this is later on. He's now made it through the night. But now he is back before what's really the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish council. But you notice you don't see that word here. Luke doesn't use that. Luke is describing Jewish systems to a Roman and kind of avoids some of those terms. But what he does is he uses 4 different terms in verse 66. He talks about the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes. I think those are all significant words. When he talks about the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, it's a very curious phrase, the assembly of the elders of the people. Well, what happens there is as he uses those 4 words, 3 of them immediately recall for the careful reader all the way back in Luke chapter 9, verse 22, when Jesus said that he was going to be drugged before the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. What's happening is exactly what he said was going to happen. And so that threefold description right at the outset just tells us, in the midst of the darkness that's happening here, God's getting what he wants done. God is accomplishing his purposes. Prophecies are being fulfilled. The word of the Lord is standing. But then that 4th word, you have the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and then you also have the people. And the people becomes this other group that's this kind of mystery group that morphs throughout this. Because as we've talked, remember, we've seen the crowds and the people. A lot of times they're neutral. A lot of times they're kind of friendly. But here they are. This is the leaders of the people. And what will the people do as they're led through this process? Where Luke puts his emphasis is on the leadership of the whole, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you don't see Luke talking about Caiaphas or the high priest, or he doesn't really look at those personalities. When it comes to the Jewish leadership, he wants us to think about the leadership as a whole, keeps the emphasis there. And what they're doing, a lot of folks, again, you can pick apart the details and try to line it up with the Jewish system of justice. It really is a kind of kangaroo court that's happening here. They're not really pursuing justice. If they were charging him with blasphemy, which is what they're doing essentially, they would require witnesses, he'd be allowed a defense. That's not what this is about. They're trying to rush this thing through, hurry their way along, get the answer that they want, regardless of the truth of the matter. Notice then their first question, even as they open their mouth. Again, it puts them in some pretty rough company. What did they say? They said, if you are the Christ, tell us. Well, where have we heard that before? It actually is a deliberate echo of the first temptation that the devil said, if you are the Christ, Luke chapter 4, verse 3. So here they are, the leaders, Jewish leadership is saying the same kind of thing that the devil said to Jesus. If you are the Christ, then show us. If you are the Christ, the other word would be Messiah. If you're Messiah, For them, they're using that term strategically because Messiah has a political overtone for them. They see that as a kind of political savior, a regal overtone. It's like a kingly figure. And when they use that, they can then use that term to get him in trouble with Rome. Because if they're going to get him executed, they're good politicians. They don't want to be held responsible for what they do. They want somebody else to be responsible. So if Rome can do the execution and not them, they'd be in a much better place. So here they are trying to get him in trouble with Rome by using that political term, framing his conviction or his crime in a way that Rome can understand. To call Jesus Messiah, to Savior, is to acknowledge his rule. And what does he say in response? If I tell you, you won't believe. If I ask you, you won't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. There's two responses. The first part, you're not going to believe me anyway, so why should we talk about this? And here is a stark assessment of the state of their hearts. Their unbelief is such that it will keep them from hearing the truth that's in front of them and seeing the truth that's in front of them. That's just a rebellion or abandonment. This is how hard of a place they are. And so from Jesus' perspective, it's really not even worth having a conversation. And I know, I'm sure you've had those kind of encounters with some folks. You might want to share your faith. I mean, as the folks have gone throughout the community, we're hanging things on the doors. Unfortunately, some of our kids have had some pretty rough encounters with people. They're not been very friendly about receiving this stuff. So they're encountering some hard-heartedness. And of course, that's one of the lessons when you do evangelism is that these are the people that most need the gospel, but sometimes people are just not receptive to it. You see a picture of that here, a hard-heartedness as they responded. But the second piece of his response says something quite interesting. From now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And he's doing something there. He's been using the Son of Man. That's his favorite phrase for himself. He's been talking about that phrase. And I said over and over, it's coming from Daniel 7. It has this sense of God's anointed one, God's empowered by God to do great things. But when he says this thing of seating at the right hand of the power of God, that's suggesting something else. That's really now talking about other echoes, not just Daniel 7 anymore. And you notice they pick up on that because they don't ask, are you the Son of Man? They said, are you the Son of God then? And what they're doing really is kind of merger, and there's probably two psalms that I would point you to. One would be Psalm 110, and the other would be Psalm 2. And at the time, they connected those two psalms and saw this picture of God's anointed one enthroned as a kingly figure who's designated the Son of God. So they are seeing this one who claims to be Son of Man, which they could see in a messianic kind of thing, maybe, sometimes. They're not sure. So it's an amorphous term. But when they're applying what he's saying about himself as the Son of Man and saying he's calling himself the Son of God, then he's claiming divine authority. And they're putting their finger on it because they're making those connections. They're connecting the dots. And that's really the trick here is that as they ask this, are you the Son of God? They're connecting the dots with what he's been saying. They understand their scripture. They understand all the allusions that he's been referring to, and they see it. And then his answer is, you say that I am, which is a kind of acknowledgement, and maybe even more so within the Greek, he says, I am. They hear that, and that's an echo of the name for God himself. They see him claiming a divine status. And his answer is a kind of bold confirmation. But it's not simply that he says, yep, you're right. It's that from your own mouth, you've confessed this. He is calling on them to confess. They respond and say, yep, we've got him. We don't need any more testimony. We don't have to, because he's said it from his own lips. He's claiming to be the Son of God. Which, of course, from us as readers of Luke, we've known all along. That's what he said up front. He is the Son of God. What he's saying is absolutely true. But then, let's see what they do with it. Now they go from the Sanhedrin, now they take him and go to Pilate. And notice verse 1 of chapter 23. It's the whole company that goes and brings him before Pilate. All of those elders and chief priests and scribes, they're still around. They're still accompanying him. They're going to be driving this story. What does he do? What do? They have this accusation. They've got a threefold charge against Jesus. Let's see how it stands up. here's their indictment. They began to accuse him, verse 2, and they say, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." All right, so what is this misleading the nation thing? Well, it's kind of a weird charge. What they're really saying is they're framing his claim to be the Son of God, to be the one who's chosen by God, sent by God, that they're framing that as a kind of political threat. And so that is their misleading and making that misleading claim. Of course, then the second thing they say is that he's forbidding giving tribute to Caesar, which Pilate is one of his responsibilities would be, as a Roman, his job was to collect the taxes. So when you're talking about him forbidding them from getting taxes, well, that's directly on point with what Pilate would care about. But that's an outright lie. It's simply not true that Jesus actually, when they gave him the coin, they tried to pin it on him. He said, "Hey, give to Caesar what's Caesar's." He threw it back at him. It's an outright lie there. Then the third thing they say, that he's saying that he himself is Christ or Messiah, a king. And again, you hear the manipulation, because what he's saying about himself is, and what they're confessing is that it's a religious title, and they're wanting that religious title to be heard politically. And anytime the politicians get a hold of religion, they can make it something that it's not. It's certainly still true today. But so what they're saying there is is true, but it's not how they mean it to be. That's not what they're intending there. That they are taking this claim, which is actually a true claim, morphing it. And I think that's a lesson for us today, that our faith can be reduced. It will be reduced if we primarily see it in political terms. It's something we always have to guard against in the political life. But they're taking this message and they're morphing it so that the politicians can grab it and take it to their own ends. And Pilate is pretty clever. He sees through it. Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, "So you've said." And immediately says, I find no guilt in this man. And thus introduces a theme that's going to be recurring throughout the rest of the section. Again and again, you're going to hear Pilate's claim he's innocent. No guilt, no guilt. He's innocent of any kind of Roman crime. But right in response to that, he says, "I find no guilt in this man." Verse 5, this is the other theme you're going to see again and again. "But they were urgent," saying he stirs up the people. And you have this declaration of innocence mixed with this increasingly vehement pressure on the part of the Jewish leadership to see that they get their way. And so they're pitting Jesus' innocence against his political needs. What's Pilate's job? Is to keep the people happy, keep the peace, make sure no one's stirred up. This is Passover weekend. We got hundreds of thousands of people in town. Things get a little rowdy. There are a bunch of Jews that get nationalistic, and when you get a bunch of people with some nationalistic fervor together, some ugly things can happen when you're the people that have conquered them. So they're nervous about it. Let's keep it clean. Let's keep it nice. Let's keep it friendly. Pilate's got this pressure. He's innocent, but they really want him dead. And so what does he do? Well, he gets an out. Verse 6. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean, because they said at the end, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place. And he says, "Wait, he's Galilean? Oh, great. I don't have jurisdiction over Galilee." Well, really, Herod should be the one we should talk to. Let's send him on to Herod. And you can hear this, you can read this moment, verse 6, in two different ways. You can see him as extending this basic courtesy. Well, Herod technically should have jurisdiction. He knows these people a lot better than I do. I'll just send him over to him. Maybe he can give me some insight into what's going on here. Or you can see him as creating this great escape to say, I just tap dance my way right around it. Jurisdiction goes to them. I can move this out of my court to someone else. I think the latter is probably closer to what's happening, especially when you get to the end of the section and you see that Herod and Pilate at this point don't even like each other. It's hard to see that he's extending courtesy to him. He's trying to get out of this. So what Luke is noting here is really two different kinds of failure of leadership. You've got the Jewish leadership that has this immense hostility to to Jesus and are determined to kill him and are willing to trump up charges and manufacture charges and manipulate the facts and lie, outright lie, anything they can do. So you see this determined vehemence against Jesus, and then it meets this system that is just indifferent to his actual innocence. It just doesn't care and cannot seem to find its way to bring justice. That's his first encounter with Pilate. Then he goes to Herod. Now he goes to King Herod. So here he is, now he's in, again, another section of this Roman leadership. Herod is this kind of sitting as this bridge because he's technically like a Jewish king, but he's appointed by Rome. And so he kind of represents this compromised leadership there. So he goes to Herod. And remember, we've heard about Herod all along. In fact, they told him a while ago that Herod was trying to kill him. He was seeking him out. So we have this ominous sense of meeting Herod. This is something that's been built up for a long time. And when we finally get this encounter, it's actually fairly underwhelming. What do we learn? Well, Herod is excited, verse 8, because he'd wanted to see him, because he heard about it and he was hoping to see some kind of sign. And right there, one, you find out that the rumor that he wanted to kill him was a lie, which we kind of suspected at the time, but it's a confirmation of that. And second, Herod is a sign seeker. And that's one of those themes that we've had again and again, is that sign seeking is generally not praised in Luke. It's one of those negative associations of somebody who's kind of there for the show but isn't really interested. So he's there for the show, and so he questions him. And so he questioned him, verse 9, he questions him at length. And what do you get? You get silence. And when Luke is writing about the silence of Jesus to Theophilus, to a Roman, it would be a surprising thing. Because a lot of times they've got a great tradition of killing prophets. And a lot of times these great martyrs, they have this moment where they can defend themselves. And so if you were kind of thinking of where you're going to tell the story, you'd really want to have a great speech right here. This is Jesus' moment. This is like the climax of the film where he gets to stand up and explain himself and show all those things. And he doesn't. And the silence, compared to the lengthy questioning from Herod, is a surprising thing for a Roman to hear. But it makes perfect sense for one who is faithful to the calling of God. Isaiah 53 speaks of the suffering servant who suffers in silence. And I think as he describes that silence and notes it, Luke is wanting us to pay attention that Jesus is that. He is that suffering servant, suffering on behalf of his people. But the questioning of Herod, wanting to show, the silence of Jesus, and what does it do? It ultimately reduces Herod to something less than the regal figure. Verse 11, Herod now joins with his soldiers in treating him with contempt and mocking him. Just lowers himself to kind of the lowest kind of level of just making fun of him. And then he's arraying him in this splendid clothing. Is it a white robe? Is it a purple robe? Don't know. But it's like this regal sense. They're mocking him as king. Shocking, especially when you're going to find out in verse 15 that Herod doesn't think he's guilty of anything. So he's going to make fun of him. He's reducing himself, really debasing himself. And in contrast, Jesus is dignified in response, enduring the suffering, enduring the shame. Herod here is a kind of parody of kingship as he mocks the king. And again, it's echoing the same thing we saw in Pilate of Rome's reluctance to do justice. Herod sees nothing here, but won't release him, sends him right back to Pilate. So now we go back to Pilate. Verse 13, what happens? Pilate calls together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, brings them all together. Notice here, the people are back in the room. This is a key moment, because what he says to them, he says, you brought me this man who's misleading the people, and after examining him before you, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. So, first off, you have the people come back in. And when they do here, what we're going to find by the time we get to verse 18 is that the people are going to be in alignment with the leadership and standing against Jesus. And for the moment, when this happens, right in this little section here, it's really a threat to the very prophecy of Luke. Because very early on, I think it was Simeon that talked about how Jesus was going to cause division. Jesus is a divider. And we've had that theme throughout Luke. Jesus divides. Jesus forces a choice, and you're going to be on one side or the other. But here, Jesus is not causing division, but union. They are uniting against him. Now, all are united together, standing against him. And they're doing so despite that threefold proclamation that we just read in 13 through 15 of the innocence of Jesus. And in fact, when Pilate references Herod from a Jewish perspective, you have two witnesses confirming his innocence. That's a big deal. That's all kind of painting for us this picture of, again and again, Pilate and Herod. The Roman perspective is he's innocent, he's innocent, he's innocent. And so what do? They cry out, verse 18. They cry out, say, away with this man and release to us Barabbas. And the description of Barabbas is significant. What do they say about him? Verse 19, they said he's a man who's been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. It's a phrase that'll be repeated twice. You'll see it again in verse 25. He's a man he's there for insurrection, so he's causing riots. So remember, the whole reason why we have this kangaroo court is because they're concerned about keeping the peace. So they're going to release a rioter, and they're going to release a murderer. And it's the people who are crying out for him. They're all crying together, the people, the leadership. They're crying out. They're now united to stand against him. And they would rather see him released, to see the guilty one released in order to crucify Jesus. And you notice the way some of the details Luke leaves out. He leaves out that it's Pilate that offers Barabbas. He leaves out stories on the reasons why he offered Barabbas. And what he does, he leaves us to see that's the people and the leadership together that are driving. They want Barabbas. They want Barabbas. They cry for him. He emphasizes their association with a criminal. And this is what they're doing. They're dirtying their hands by aligning themselves. And what does he do in response to that? Again, a threefold proclamation of innocence. Pilate addressed him once more, desiring to release Jesus. But they kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. A third time he said to them, why? What evil has he done? I found in him no guilt deserving death. They were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate is reinforcing Jesus' innocence while the people are insisting on death. Now, I skipped over, I think it's one of those kind of ironic lines. Verse 16, after he gives this threefold declaration of his innocence, he said, well, since he's innocent, I'll just punish him and release him. What are you going to punish him for? He's innocent. But that's that unwillingness to really pursue justice, to do his job. It's a broken system. Fails in what he's called to do. And then the last line, their voices prevailed. He gives in the demand. Verse 25, he released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. And in that last moment, the people are condemned as Jesus is convicted, because in that last sentence, they are aligning themselves with murder, with insurrection. They are aligning themselves with the guilty in order to punish the innocent. So what do you do with all of that? Well, Luke paints the picture of a system that failed. If you were coming in as like a legal theorist trying to understand your justice system, this would be a case study of what went wrong. And you'd probably want to come back and say, how do we improve this? But even as Luke describes it as a failure of the system, be clear about what's happening here. That for Luke, the driver was not the broken system, but the hearts that were broken in their ability to discern and be willing to follow Jesus. It was a heart issue. And you saw it from the very beginning. You saw the leadership whose hearts had turned against them. You see the people ultimately aligned and joining with the leadership and turning against Jesus. The system failure allowed those who should have seen Jesus rightly to push through an evil agenda so that a murderer was freed and an innocent man was slain. So broken systems matter. We see broken systems today. They matter a lot. But they can't distract us from the heart work of knowing Jesus and following him. A lot of times what broken systems do is they allow the evil intentions of people to accomplish what they want. So the broken systems matter. The harder work is changing the hearts of people. And that's what Jesus came to do, to change our hearts. That even in the midst of a broken system, if the people long for goodness and virtue and justice, good can happen, even in the midst of brokenness. Luke invites us to consider his innocence. Again and again, the Romans are saying, he's innocent, he's innocent, he's innocent. And it asks us to consider that he is, in fact, who they accused him of being. They call him the Son of Man, the Son of God. He's all those things. They call him a ruler. Well, yeah, he's that too. And in considering all of this, back to that very first thing in verse 66, that all that's unfolding here is the fulfillment of God's plan. It's the fulfillment of God's purpose. Even as evil reigns, this is the hour of evil that Jesus told them when they arrested him. This is your hour, the power of darkness. Even in the midst of the power of darkness, God is accomplishing something because the Son of Man, the Son of God, the ruler, the King, the one who sits at the right hand of God, is doing all of this to redeem us. The trials of Jesus are meant to awaken our heart. As we look at those who are hard-hearted and cold to the purposes of Jesus, it invites us to turn our hearts toward him. I pray that we do so. Let's pray. God, I pray your blessing on each of us. Soften our hearts, that we would hear your message and see what you did for us and long to be yours and to live for you in all we do. In Jesus' name, amen. If we can help in any way, please come while we stand and sing.